So the stack of papers in front of us today, I mean, it is not for the faint of heart.
No, not at all. These are the heavyweights.
So we have Miller's Anesthesia, Guyton's Physiology, sections from Harrison's, and even some, crinkled, coffee-stained, handwritten notes from a lecture hall in Ahmedabad.
The holy texts, so to speak.
Exactly. And we're not just reviewing them for fun today. We have a really specific mission. We are simulating the long answer question. You are sitting in that exam hall, the clock is ticking, and the question on the paper worth a full 20 marks is, describe the mechanism of consciousness and its anesthetic implications.
That is a beast of a question.
It is.
It's the kind of question that, well, it looks simple on the surface. We knock people out every single day, so surely we know how it works. But when you actually have to put pen to paper, it's a minefield.
It feels like the ultimate Viva Voce trap. So for this deep dive, we're sort of role-playing.
Right.
You are the senior faculty, the internal examiner who has heard every wrong answer in the book. I'm the candidate just trying to secure my MD.
I like it. I'll be listening for the key words. And if you don't say the specific phrases, you don't get the marks. Simple as that.
Deal. So let's start right where the pen hits the paper. Section 1, the introduction. If I just write, consciousness is being awake, I'm assuming I've already failed.
You haven't failed, but you're definitely not getting honors. In an anesthesiology exam, specifically for Gujarat University or really any major board, consciousness is a physiological construct. It is not philosophy.
Right.
You need to define it immediately as the integration of two distinct components. You must use these words.
Two components?
Arousal and awareness.
Arousal and awareness. This is the classic Miller definition.
It is. And you need to be precise about what they mean. Arousal is simply wakefulness. It's the crude vegetative state of having the lights on. It's purely subcortical.
Okay, so it's the power switch.
Exactly. Whereas awareness is the content of that consciousness.
Yeah.
It's the sum of your cognitive functions.
Yeah.
Memory, processing information, emotional response, all the higher stuff. Think of it like this. Imagine a television set. Arousal is just plugging the TV into the wall and hitting the power button.
Okay.
The screen glows gray, you hear static, the system is energized. That is arousal.
But there's no show on yet. There's no picture.
Correct. Awareness is the actual broadcast. It's the news, the movie, the picture on the screen. And here's the key. You can have the TV on without a picture.
Which would be a vegetative state.
Precisely. But you cannot have the picture without the power. You can't have awareness without arousal.
That distinction is so critical for us because as anesthetists, we play with these variables completely independently.
We do. And that's why this is question number 1 in so many exams. We are the only specialty in medicine whose entire job description is to pharmacologically extinguish this faculty and then hopefully reverse it perfectly.
Right.
If you don't understand the difference between these two, you run the risk of the ultimate nightmare. A patient who is aware but unable to move or signal their arousal.
Awareness under anesthesia. A terrifying concept we will definitely get back to. So, okay, I've laid out the definition. Consciousness equals arousal plus awareness. I need to move on. Section 2. Levels and states of consciousness. This feels like a place where I could just ramble and lose valuable time.
Do not ramble. You need to be systematic. Stick to the high-yield clinical continuum. You start with normal wakefulness.
Normal wakefulness.
The key phrase here is connected consciousness. You are processing the environment, you can respond appropriately. Simple. Then you move to sleep.
Okay, hold on. This is a trap. I know it is. I've been grilled on this before. If I say sleep is when you're unconscious, the examiner usually just scoffs.
Because it's lazy. It's an imprecise answer. The winning phrase, the one you need to write down is, sleep is a state of reversible unconsciousness from which the person can be aroused by sensory stimuli.
The can be aroused part is the key differentiator.
It is the absolute operative distinction from anesthesia or coma. Precisely.
Yeah.
If I shake you, you wake up.
Right.
If I shake a patient who's on a propofol infusion, they don't. Okay. And it's worth a mark to briefly mention the phases NREM and REM, just to show you know them. And you can add a little clinical pearl that anesthesia, particularly deep sedation, often resembles NREM slow-wave sleep on an EEG.
But functionally, it's totally different.
Totally different. Because of that lack of arousability.
Okay, so we've gone from normal wakefulness to sleep. Now we descend into the pathological states. This is usually where ICU rounds and Harrison's come into play.
Yes. You need to differentiate in order confusion, stupor, coma, and the vegetative state.
Confusion or delirium seems pretty straightforward. Arousal is intact. The patient is awake, but their awareness is garbled.
Right. The TV is on, but the signal is scrambled. Good. Next is stupor.
Stupor is the patient who looks asleep, but they only arouse to vigorous, often painful stimuli like a sternal rub, and then they just drift right back off as soon as you stop.
Correct. And then coma.
Unarousable unresponsiveness. The eyes are closed, there's no sleep-wake cycle, the lights are off, and nobody is home.
Which implies a failure of both the arousal system, the RAS, and the cortex. But the one that really catches people out, the one they often confuse, is the vegetative state.
This is the classic lights are on but nobody's home scenario.
Exactly. In a vegetative state, the brainstem is working. The reticular activating system is firing. So the patient has sleep-wake cycles.
They open their eyes.
They open their eyes. They might even grunt or have some reflex movements. But there is absolutely no cortical function, no awareness. It is, and you must use this phrase, wakefulness without awareness.
That really solidifies the underlying anatomy, doesn't it? It proves you can have a functioning brainstem but a non-functioning cortex.
And that segues you perfectly into Section 3, the anatomical basis of consciousness. If you've defined the states properly, the examiner is now expecting you to draw the map of where it all happens.
The Trinity of consciousness.
Yes. If you miss one of these three structures, you lose marks. It's the reticular activating system, RAS, the thalamus, and the cerebral cortex.
Let's build this from the bottom up. The RAS. I always picture this as a specific organ in the brainstem, but that's not quite right, is it?
No, and please don't draw it as a little lump in your diagram. It's a network. The reticular formation is a loose web of neurons running all through the pons in the midbrain. Think of the RAS as the battery of the brain.
The power source, okay.
Its job is to generate a constant stream of excitatory signals, ascending signals that shoot up to the brain to keep the lights on. That's why it's more accurately called the RIS, the ascending reticular activating system.
And it's driven by all the sensory input we're getting.
Massive amounts of it. Collaterals from the spinothalamic tracts, from the auditory pathways, visual pathways, they all feed into the RAS.
Right.
It explains why a loud noise wakes you up.
Right.
The auditory nerve pokes the RAS, and the RAS basically yells at the rest of the brain to pay attention.
So the RAS generates the wake-up signal. It then shoots it up to component number 2, the thalamus.
The gatekeeper. This, for me, is the most fascinating part of the anatomy, because it explains so much about how our drugs actually work. The thalamus sits right in the center of the brain.
The great relay station.
Exactly. Almost every single piece of sensory data, vision, touch, sound, pain, it all has to pass through the thalamus to get to the cortex.
Except smell, right? Olfaction is the one that bypasses it.
Yes, olfaction is the ancient exception. It goes straight to the limbic system, but everything else must pass the gate. Now, here is the Miller pearl for the exam, the thing that will get you the extra marks. The thalamus has two distinct modes of firing.
Tonic mode and burst mode.
Correct. When you are awake and alert, the thalamus is in tonic mode. It's a faithful relay. The eye sees a bird, the thalamus sends the signal bird to the cortex. But when we drift into sleep or when we push propofol, the thalamus becomes hyperpolarized.
And it switches into burst mode.
Right. It starts firing in these rhythmic oscillating bursts. And effectively, this burst mode closes the gate. It creates a functional blockade. The sensory information hits the thalamus and just stops dead. It never reaches the cortex.
So the cortex is essentially cut off from the outside world.
It's completely isolated. The anesthetic has locked the gate. And if you really want full marks, you must mention the specific nuclei involved. The intralaminar nuclei and the reticular nucleus of the thalamus are the key players in controlling this gate.
Okay, so RAS is the battery, thalamus is the gate, and finally, the cerebral cortex.
The processor. This is where awareness actually lives, but it's not a one-way street. You need to mention the feedback loop.
Ah.
The cortex needs the RAS to stay awake, but the RAS also needs feedback from the cortex to maintain that vigilance. It's a reverberating circuit, the famous corticothalamocortical loop.
That's the diagram I need to draw. Arrows going up from the brainstem, but also arrows coming back down from the cortex.
Exactly. Consciousness isn't a single place in the brain. It's a constant reverberation of energy between these three structures.
All right, so we've built the machine. Now we need to power it. Section 4 is physiological mechanisms, or as I like to call it, the neurochemical soup.
This is where candidates can get mixed up because there are so many acronyms and nuclei. You have to categorize them. There are two main pathways that the RAS uses to wake up the brain.
Okay.
The cholinergic pathway and the monoaminergic pathway.
Cholinergic is acetylcholine.
Right, originating from the pedunculopontine tegmental nuclei, And maybe don't try to say that 3 times fast in a Viva.
PPT and LDT nuclei. I think I'll stick to the acronyms.
Fair enough. These cholinergic fibers project mainly to the thalamus. Their job is to induce that tonic mode we just talked about. They essentially grease the hinges of the gate so it stays open for business.
Okay, so acetylcholine opens the thalamic gate. What about the monoaminergic pathway?
These tend to bypass the thalamus and spray directly onto the cortex, like a sprinkler system. You need to know the big 4 sources for the exam. First, norepinephrine.
From the locus coeruleus, that's the famous blue spot in the brainstem.
Correct. And norepinephrine drives vigilance. It's the fight-or-flight attention system in the brain. Second, serotonin.
From the Raphi nuclei.
Right, which regulates mood and the overall sleep-wake cycle. Third, and this one's important, histamine.
From the tuberomammillary nucleus, the TMN.
And this is crucial for clinical correlation. Why do first-generation antihistamines like Benadryl or promethazine knock you out?
Because they cross the blood-brain barrier and block this critical wakefulness signal coming from the TMN.
Exactly. And fourth, you have dopamine from the ventral tegmental area, or VTA, which is involved in arousal and motivation. But there is a fifth player, a peptide that acts as the master stabilizer of this whole system.
Orexin, also known as hypocretin.
Yes. Orexin is produced in the lateral hypothalamus. Think of orexin as the conductor of the orchestra. It reinforces all those other centers, the locus coeruleus, the rapha, the TMN. It projects to them and forces them to stay active and fire together.
And if you lose those orexin neurons,
you get narcolepsy. The patient's brain simply cannot sustain wakefulness, and they just drop into sleep states unpredictably.
So that's the wake side of the equation. But for anesthesia, we're really more interested in the sleep side. What is it that turns this whole system off?
The sleep switch. You must memorize this name for the exam. The ventrolateral preoptic nucleus, or VLPO, of the hypothalamus.
VLPO sounds like a villain in a sci-fi movie. What does it release?
It releases GABA and ghrelin, both of which are inhibitory neurotransmitters. The VLPO sends out long axons to all those arousal centers we just named, the locus coeruleus, the TMN, the rapha, and it actively shuts them down.
So it's a constant battle between these two systems.
It is. The literature describes it as a flip-flop switch. Imagine a light switch that's spring-loaded. It wants to be either fully on or fully off. It doesn't like to hover in the middle.
I see.
So either the arousal centers are firing and inhibiting the VLPO, which keeps you awake, or the VLPO is firing and inhibiting the arousal centers, which puts you to sleep.
And this flip-flop mechanism prevents us from walking around in a half-dream state all the time.
Exactly. Stability is key for survival. And what anesthetics do, especially the GABA agents like propofol, is they put a heavy thumb on the scale for the VLPO. They chemically assist the sleep center to win that battle.
That is a fantastic mental model, the flip-flop. Okay, let's move on to section 5. We've done the anatomy, we've done the neurotransmitters. Now the examiner points to the BIS monitor or the raw EEG on the screen and says, what does consciousness look like, Doc?
Right. This is section 5, electrophysiological correlates. You need to be able to link the EEG frequency to the clinical state. So start with awake.
Beta waves. They're high frequency, greater than 13 hertz, low amplitude, and desynchronized.
Desynchronized is the absolute key word. The brain is doing a million different things at once.
So it looks like chaos
on the EEG.
Yeah.
And that chaos is consciousness. Now ask the patient to close their eyes and relax.
We shift into alpha waves, a bit slower, 8 to 13 hertz.
And crucially, where are they located on the scalp?
In the occipital region, at the back of the brain.
Correct. Now, we push the propofol, we induce anesthesia. What happens to the waves?
They get much slower and much taller. We see theta waves, which are 4 to 7 hertz, and then delta waves, 0.5 to 4 hertz.
And they become synchronized. Because the thalamus has shut the gate, the cortex has nothing to process. So the neurons start idling together in this slow, rhythmic chant. But there's a very specific spatial shift you must mention to really impress the examiner. It's called the anteriorization of alpha.
The alpha shift.
Yes.
Yeah.
Remember we just said that in a relaxed state, alpha's in the back. Under anesthesia, specifically with GABAergic drugs like zolpidem or propofol, that alpha power actually migrates to the frontal cortex.
So if you have a multi-channel EEG, you can literally see the activity move from the back of the head to the front.
You do. It is a hallmark of the anesthetized state. If you mention anteriorization, the examiner knows you've read the advanced chapters of Miller, not just the basics.
And if we keep pushing the drug, if we go too deep or overdose,
we reach the state of burst suppression. The EEG goes flat isoelectric for seconds at a time, interrupted by these random bursts of high-frequency activity.
Okay.
This represents profound metabolic downregulation of the brain. We sometimes use this intentionally for neuroprotection, say during aneurysm clipping, but for routine general surgery, it's usually a sign that you're too deep.
Right. Let's pivot to pharmacology, section 6. Mechanisms of loss of consciousness. We know what happens to the brain waves, but how do the drugs actually do it?
Historically, you have to give a nod to the lipid theory, the Meyer-Overton correlation. The idea that anesthetic potency correlates with lipid solubility.
Right. The old idea that the gas dissolves in the cell membrane and causes it to expand or change function?
Exactly. Say that, acknowledge it was a prevailing theory for 100 years, and then immediately discard it.
Okay.
We now know definitively that anesthetics work on specific protein targets ion channels and receptors, which transitions you perfectly to section 7, anesthetic-induced unconsciousness.
So let's group the drugs. First, the heavy hitters. Propofol, etomidate, barbiturates, benzodiazepines.
These are all primarily GABAergic. They bind to the GABA-A receptor. And as you know, GABA is the main inhibitory neurotransmitter in the brain. When these drugs bind, they keep the chloride channels on the neuron open for longer.
Chloride's a negative ion, so it flows into the cell.
And the neuron becomes hyperpolarized. It becomes much harder to fire an action potential. Effectively, these drugs are supercharging the VLPO and dampening the RAS. It's a double whammy on that flip-flop switch.
What about the volatile agents? Acetylchlorine, isoflurane, desflurane.
They're what you'd call promiscuous. They're dirty drugs. They definitely hit GABA receptors, but they also inhibit excitatory glutamate receptors, nicotinic receptors, and they mess with potassium channels. They basically attack the system from all sides at once.
Then there's the oddball in the group, ketamine.
Ketamine is completely different. It's an NMDA receptor antagonist. NMDA is the main excitatory receptor. So by blocking it, ketamine doesn't cause sedation in the same way. It causes dissociative anesthesia.
How does a dissociated patient look different from a patient on propofol?
This is a critical distinction for the exam. With propofol, the whole system powers down. The patient looks asleep. With ketamine, the eyes might be open.
Right.
The RAS might still be firing. But the connection between the thalamus and the cortex, and just as importantly, between different parts of the cortex, is completely severed.
So the patient is technically awake in terms of brainstem arousal, but they are completely cut off from processing sensory input or forming any coherent memory.
Exactly. They're there, but they aren't there. It's a profound disconnection.
And finally, what about dexmedetomidine? We use it a lot for ICU sedation now.
Dex is an alpha-2 agonist. It works almost exclusively on the locus coeruleus. By activating the inhibitory alpha-2 receptors there, it shuts down that norepinephrine drive for vigilance.
Ah, so it's very targeted.
Very targeted. And because it works on a specific natural sleep pathway, Dex sleep looks almost identical to physiological non-REM sleep. That's why you can often wake a patient on Dex just by talking to them and they'll drift right back off. You can't do that with a patient on propofol.
That's a great clinical correlation. Okay, we need to synthesize all this. The examiner asks, so is it just about turning off the RAS or is there more to it?
This is where you bring in the high-level theories from Miller. There are two main hypotheses. First, the bottle-up theory. This is what we've mostly been discussing. Anesthetics hit the brainstem and hypothalamus, they dampen the RAS, and they kill the arousal drive. No battery, no TV.
Simple enough.
But that doesn't explain everything, especially the dissociative state with ketamine. So we have the top-down or cognitive unbinding hypothesis. This is also known as information integration theory.
Cognitive unbinding. It sounds quite poetic.
It refers to the disruption of functional connectivity. Think of the conscious brain as an orchestra. All the musicians are playing in harmony.
Okay.
The individual musicians, the neurons, might still be playing their instruments just fine under anesthesia, but anesthetics take away the conductor and put soundproof glass walls between all the sections of the orchestra.
So the visual center sees red, and the memory center knows what a rose is, but they can't talk to each other to form the concept, I am seeing a red rose.
Exactly. The bandwidth between brain regions is cut. The parietal lobe, which processes sensory information, gets disconnected from the frontal lobe, which handles executive function. Information cannot be synthesized into a unified conscious moment. Anesthetics cause a fundamental collapse of integration.
That's a much more powerful concept. It moves beyond just making the brain sleepy and into disintegrating the conscious experience.
It's the modern answer. It shows you understand the network effect of consciousness, not just the on-off switch.
Let's get practical. Section 8 and 9, clinical correlation and monitoring. We're in the OR. The patient is draped. How do we know they're actually unconscious?
Historically, we use grade L's, stages, pupil size, respiratory pattern, muscle tone.
Yeah.
But let me ask you, can you use respiratory pattern if you've given rocuronium?
No, of course not. They're paralyzed.
Can you use pupil size if you've given fentanyl and other opioids?
No, the pupils will be pinpoint regardless.
Exactly. Modern anesthesia, what we call balanced anesthesia, masks almost all of the classic clinical signs. This is why we're often left relying on crude hemodynamics, which are nonspecific, or processed EEG monitors like BIS, the bispectral index, or Entropy.
How do you explain BIS to an examiner without sounding like you're just a company salesman?
You say, BIS is a dimensionless number from 0 to 100 that is derived from the raw frontal EEG. It uses a proprietary algorithm to process the frequency, amplitude, and phase relationships, the bispectrum, to generate a single score.
Right.
100 is wide awake. 0 is an isoelectric EEG or brain death. And the target range for general anesthesia is 40 to 60.
And what does that 40 to 60 range actually represent?
It represents a high statistical probability of unconsciousness and, crucially, amnesia or lack of recall. But you must add the caveat, BIS measures hypnosis, not nociception or pain.
That is the big trap. You can have a patient with a BIS of 45, but if you make a surgical incision and their heart rate shoots up to 140, they are clearly reacting to a stimulus.
And ketamine. Don't forget ketamine. Ketamine increases high-frequency activity in the brain. It can give you a BIS reading of 90 even when the patient is fully anesthetized and dissociated. You have to treat the numbers with clinical caution.
This leads us to the dark side of our specialty, awareness. We need to define this carefully for the exam.
You do. You need to distinguish explicit memory from implicit memory. Explicit memory is conscious recall. The patient says, I remember hearing the surgeon asking for a scalpel. I fit the cut. This is what leads to PTSD and lawsuits.
And implicit memory.
This is more subtle. The patient has no verbal recall of events, but weeks later they develop new anxiety, nightmares, or other behavioral changes. The brain stored the traumatic input, even if the conscious mind didn't form a narrative around it.
And here is the exam trap question I've seen on past papers. The examiner asks, candidate, if the patient doesn't move, are they unconscious?
And the answer is a hard, unequivocal NO. Unresponsiveness does not equal unconsciousness. If you have given a muscle relaxant, you have removed the patient's ability to signal their consciousness. They could be wide awake, experiencing 10 out of 10 pain, and be completely locked in.
Locked in. That phrase just chills me to the bone every time.
It should. That is why understanding these mechanisms isn't just an academic exercise. It's a matter of basic human rights and patient safety. You should also briefly mention other disorders of consciousness for clinical correlation.
You mean like the vegetative state versus a minimally conscious state?
Yes, just for a short note. A minimally conscious state means the patient has intermittent but reproducible signs of awareness. They might track an object with their eyes or follow a simple command, which is a step up from the vegetative state where there is none of that.
Okay, we are in the home stretch. Section 10, the Viva Survival Guide. I'm going to throw some rapid-fire questions at you. Questions I've seen come up in the Gujarat University papers and the national boards. You give me the safe answer.
Hit me.
Question 1. Candidate, is anesthesia the same as sleep?
No. Anesthesia is a drug-induced reversible state of unarousability. Physiological sleep is reversible with a simple sensory stimulus. Anesthesia is not, at least not until the drug is cleared or redistributed from its site of action.
Good. Question 2. Where do volatile anesthetics act to cause immobility versus unconsciousness?
This one separates the pass from the honor students. Immobility, the patient not moving when we cut, is largely a spinal cord effect. Unconsciousness is a supraspinal effect happening in the brain and thalamus.
Wait, really? The immobility part is spinal?
Yes. This relates to the very definition of MC, the minimum alveolar concentration. MC is actually a spinal reflex measurement. You can literally decerebrate an animal, remove its brain completely, and the MAC of a volatile agent required to prevent movement to a stimulus is almost unchanged.
That blows my mind every time I hear it. So it's possible to be immobile from a spinal effect but still be awake in your brain if the concentrations are wrong.
Yes. This is why we have the concept of MCUC awake, which is the concentration at which patients will follow commands. It's usually around 0.3 to 0.4 MAC. It takes much less drug to turn off the brain than it does to turn off the spine.
Wow. Okay, question 3. What is the key difference between a vegetative state and brain death?
In a vegetative state, the brainstem and the RAS are intact. Arousal is present, even if awareness is not. In brain death, there is the irreversible loss of all brain function. Brainstem, RAS, and cortex. No arousal, no awareness, no respiratory drive, nothing.
Perfect. Section 11. Diagrams and presentation. I'm holding my pen. I have a blank page in the answer booklet. I need to draw a diagram to break up the text and get some easy marks. What do I draw?
You need 3 simple diagrams to look professional. Diagram 1, the RAS schematic. Draw a lateral view of the brainstem. Draw a spray of arrows shooting up from the pons and midbrain. Label them ascending reticular activating system. Have them split one branch going to the thalamus and one bypassing it to go directly to the cortex.
Easy enough. Diagram 2.
The thalamocortical loop. Just draw a circle, put the thalamus at the bottom and the cortex at the top. Draw arrows going both ways to show the feedback. Label it reverberating loop. Then draw a big pair of scissors or a stop sign labeled anesthetics, cutting the line that goes from the thalamus up to the cortex.
That shows the mechanism very clearly. And diagram 3.
The flip-flop switch. Draw 2 boxes. Label one sleep center, VLPO, and the other wake centers, resminoamines. Then draw inhibitory lines, so lines with a flat head or a minus sign at the end, going from each box to the other. It visually shows that when one is on, the other must be off.
Those 3 diagrams cover the anatomy, the physiology, and the mechanism of action. Plus, they take up a good half a page of space, which examiners always love because it makes the answer look so structured.
And it saves you from writing another 300 words of dense prose when you're short on time.
We've covered a massive amount of ground here. Section 12, summary and conclusion. From the basic definition of arousal and awareness to the specific neurotransmitters, the anteriorization of alpha waves, and the cognitive unbinding theory. Let's wrap this up with a final thought, something to leave the listener and the examiner thinking about.
Okay. Consider the concept of neural inertia.
Inertia, like in physics. An object in motion stays in motion.
Exactly like that.
Yeah.
I used to think that waking up from anesthesia was just the reverse of falling asleep, like rewinding a videotape. If you fall asleep at an end-tidal concentration of 2% sevoflurane, you should wake up at 2%, right?
But you don't. You wake up at a much lower concentration, maybe 0.5% or 1%?
Correct. The path to unconsciousness, which is induction, and the path back to consciousness, which is emergence, are different. There's a lag. This phenomenon is called hysteresis. The brain resists state changes. It fights to stay awake when you are inducing it, and it fights to stay asleep when you're trying to emerge it.
The brain is stubborn.
It is. It has neural inertia. And understanding why that resistance happens and how things like genetics or age or pathology affect it is really the next frontier in consciousness research. If you drop a term like that in your conclusion, you show you're thinking beyond the textbook.
Neural inertia. I love it. Senior faculty, thank you. I feel like I can actually tackle this beast of a question now without just sounding like a philosopher.
You're welcome. Just remember the core concepts: arousal versus awareness, RAS versus cortex, the flip-flop switch. You'll do fine.
To our listeners, go crush that exam. Write clearly, label your diagrams, and we'll see you on the next deep dive.